In this video, let's start talking about Python modules. So the first question is, what is a module and what problem are we trying to solve? So in Python, we can obviously create just a program, so we have a simple program here, and we can just execute this program. So this program just assigns an IP address, then just prints out a string, and the string has the variable embedded inside it. This is using Python's f strings, which are new in Python 3.6, and this curly brace notation here lets you print out a variable that exists in your program. So here it's going to print out the IP address as part of this string. So if we go ahead and just run that, you can see that we get what we would expect, which is the DNS server IP and then our variable included in that output string. So that's all fine and good. We just have a simple Python program that we execute. Now, what if we tried to import that module? What if we tried to import that Python file? So we could say import my module 1. So notice there's no .py on the end of it. Also notice that this Python file name was chosen such that it was a valid Python name. In other words, we used only alphanumeric characters. We use a underscore for word separators. We don't have a leading digit at the beginning. So this file name here was chosen such that it could be used with an import statement. So in general, you want to name your Python files valid Python names, which this my module 1 is. Now notice what happens when we do this import statement. So what happens when we do this import statement is it actually prints out that string. Or more generically, what Python does when we do an import is, one, it goes and looks up, how do I find this file? And we'll talk about how it finds files in a little bit, but it basically goes and finds something corresponding to this my underscore module 1, and it has a process for doing that. In this case, one of the first places it's going to look is in the current working directory. And it's going to look for a file called my underscore module 1.py in the current working directory. It finds it. Now, when it finds that file, it is basically going to go ahead and execute it from top to bottom, everything inside of it. So in this case, it basically assigns this variable and prints out this string. And this doesn't matter, and I'll show you the second form of the from in a minute, where you say from something, from my module 1, import something. That doesn't change that execution process. It still starts at the very top of the file and executes all the lines inside the file. Okay, so a Python module is just a Python file that we import. So a module is just a Python file that we import. Now, what if we had a module that instead of having just executable code in it, like we saw in that last program, what if it had a function defined in it? So here you can see I have a function called DNS underscore IP. It has one argument, a DNS server, and then it's going to print that out. So by default, it's going to use 8.8.8.8 for the DNS server. We could also pass in different DNS servers as arguments when we call this function. Now notice there's no other executable code in here. There's no actual invocation calls of this function. So all this code does is define the function. So once again, we could go ahead and execute it. It would execute fine. It's not going to show anything on output because all the execution does is define that function. Now, what if we went into IPython and we said let's actually just do import my module 2. So we didn't see anything come out because the only thing that happened in that code, it still went from top to the bottom, executed all the lines in there, but the only thing that was in that code was actually the function definition. Now, with this import statement, we can now invoke that function. So if we look at dir, which is very useful for figuring out what's available in a given context in your program, we're going to look at dir on my module 2 and see what's available to us from that module. Now we have a whole bunch of dunder methods, these special magic methods that Python provides. But notice at the very end we have one method that's not a dunder method, this DNS_IP. And we could reference that by going as follows. Now if I don't put the parentheses after it, it's just going to provide a reference to the function itself. So we can see it's a function. We can see actually the argument that it's going to take. This DNS server, we can actually see the default value. Now if I provide the parentheses, it's actually going to execute that function. So you can see there, it's executing that function, it's calling it. So this code here, this module, we can import it and we can execute it. And like we could have invoke it with a different DNS server if we wanted to, and then we'd get, a different message printed out. So we are able to import this code and use this DNS_IP function. Now, I showed you the import my module 2 as one way to import this. A second way we could import this is say from my module 2 import something. In this case, I'm going to import this DNS_IP function. So, and then if we look at dir, we can see we have a whole bunch of dunder methods. We have some things that are specific to IPython, but we also see in here, we see this DNS_IP function is available to us. So now one question you should have is, what is the difference between the import statement when you do it this way and the import statement when you do it from my module 2 import DNSIP. So both of those go through the entire module and execute all the lines one after the other. The difference in behavior between the two is the namespaces that you use. So in the first case, and let me get a clean Python interpreter. So if I go import my module 2, everything inside that module you're going to have to reference by prefixing it with the my_module2 names and then things that are inside that. In this case, DNS_IP. In the other case, in the from import case, so if we say from my module 2, import DNSIP, the names get brought in directly into your current namespace. So as opposed to having to prefix it, we can just directly reference it as DNS_IP. That also implies that you can't have anything else in your program with this exact name, because otherwise you would have a name conflict and the last one that you assigned would basically win, that it would take over that name and the other one would no longer be referenced by that. Okay, so we have two ways of doing imports, and as we've seen, we can create a simple Python module, but by just writing Python code in it, and then by just importing it in one of those two ways that we just learned.